We saw the results of war every day in every patient, 12, 14 hours, whatever the length of our shift happened to be that day. And we went from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, and each one had a story. In Vietnam, choppers that went down crashed and burned, so we always had burns. This young pilot survived, and he was in my unit. I'm going to hang his IV, and I look at his chart, and it's his birthday. So I say to him, "Hey, it's your birthday today, happy birthday." But I see the year he was born, and it was like, is this a mistake? You can't be 20 today. I said, "Did you lie about your age?" He said, "No, ma'am." He said, "No, I graduated from high school when I was 18. I joined the Army, and helicopter training was 9 months, and here I am."
How many patients do you think you treated?
Thousands. There is no doubt. Thousands. Thousands. It was an evacuation hospital. Now what that means is it's about 400 beds. And in 68, 69, an evacuation hospital, we were rotating those patients out constantly to make room for the new guys coming in. I'll share with you one example of one night in Vietnam because it's still so vivid in my memory because I can't ever forget it. It's very dangerous. We have sappers trying to get in through the concertina wire. We had one of our guards was shot out of the tower, one of our medics. Our patients were coming to us now by chopper within 20 minutes. Well, one night a chopper came in and it was shaking. I swear the hooch was shaking. And I thought, what is that? Well, it was a Chinook. They brought a Chinook in with patients. That's how many patients they brought in that night. Now the patients start coming in. But they're not wounded. Why are these guys so sick? They were dehydrated, they were dirty, there was vomit, there was everything. There's no lighting. We worked in the dark at Pleiku because our hospital could not be lit because we got hit too often. We got rockets and mortars. So we have flashlights. So I said to my medic, just hold the flashlight until I get this started. And then we went to the next and the next and the next. They were out there stranded. And so to my first patient, I said, well, you're safe now. You're gonna live, you're safe. He was so dehydrated, I could hardly find his vein. They were collapsed, and he was dirty, so the scrubbing, and then just by feel, and of course by now, I am good at IVs. Every nurse in Vietnam I could practically start IVs in the dark, and I was starting an IV in the dark. And I got that IV in, and then we went to the next, and the next, and the next. I was one lone nurse with one lone medic, and these patients all needed life-saving care, and we were all they got. We were it. One medic and one lone Army nurse. We were all they had. The motto of the Army Nurse Corps is preserve the fighting strength. And it was our job to do whatever it took, under whatever circumstances, to save their life. There were 28 patients that night that we started IVs and got some life going back into them. All those 28 survived. The other night that I remember vividly was when we were rocketed and mortared. Your training kicks in, you grab your helmet, grab your flak jacket, because if you get hit, what good are you to your patients? And soon as the red alert siren went on, and then we heard the incoming, and there was shrapnel flying around, that's when SOP, we learned get your patients under the bed. Well, we didn't have to tell our patients to get under the bed. They were already under the bed. They woke up like that, and they hit the ground, or they hit, like in the jungle. You do what it takes to, survive. And now they've pulled out their bloodlines, they've pulled out their IVs. We do have extensions, so if they ever have to get under the beds. So now I've got one guy, the bloodline, he's pulled that out and there's blood everywhere. So I get his bloodline back together. He's now under the bed, and then we throw mattresses on the tops of the guys who have trachs and chest tubes and can't get under the bed. So I'm throwing mattresses on. There's one other military nurse with me, female, and 2 medics, and we're just doing everything we can to protect them in the best way that we can. But the little girl in the unit, because we were caring for Vietnamese civilians and children who were injured in the crossfires of the war, she had napalm burn. And I say this because that little girl came into our unit screaming in pain. And when we got hit, she started screaming because it scared her like the night her village was bombed. And she started screaming. I couldn't throw a mattress on top of her because she was badly burned. I went under her crib and I just held her hand, and she screamed herself to death. You didn't come first, your patients came first. That was just part of why we were there. Was I afraid of dying? I think by that time I was so numb, I had resigned myself to it. Well, if I die here, that's my lot, just like the men. I resigned myself to I might not come home. Just when we got good at what we were doing in Vietnam, we left. Same with the guys, the infantrymen, the soldiers. They got good at what they were doing, and our tour of duty was over, and we turned it over to the new people. I left a patient who I'll never forget because he was my last patient, and he had a trach, and he had chest tubes, and he was on a ventilator. I wrote notes to him, and he wrote notes back to me because he couldn't talk. I told him that I was going to be leaving the next day, and he became very agitated, and he wrote me a note, "Don't go home." He wanted me to stay with him. I think he knew he was going to die. I felt like I was abandoning him. I'm going home to now, I realize from all the reports that it is going to be hostile to us. I'm hearing they're protesting the soldiers because I'm hearing from soldiers who have rotated out and they've gone home and they decided to come back. They re-upped to come back for a second year, third year maybe. And they're telling us how when they went home they got spit on. It's beyond me. That era is just beyond me, how our society could have turned their backs on soldiers, not separating the war from the warrior. I am proud of my generation. We stepped up and we served. And we were as honorable as the greatest generation. And my soldiers, my patients were just as brave as World War II veterans. And we came home and were treated so deplorably. It was hostile. These young men are suffering and dying in Vietnam, and yet they're coming home to a country that is scorning them and denigrating them. I never thought about how we'd be treated, because who would spit on a nurse? You know, nurses save lives, right? Well, I found out that their animosity was directed to us as well. I'm now at a civilian hospital in San Antonio, Texas, and I think I'm doing fine with Vietnam. I'm just, you know, it's in my memories, it's just in the recess of my mind, and I'm not thinking about Vietnam. Or at least I thought I wasn't. And so I am now a recovery room nurse in a civilian hospital, and the recovery room is slow, and the OR nurse comes out and says that I'm needed in the OR immediately for an emergency. And I said, I am not an operating room nurse. No, I will not go. I'm a recovery ICU nurse. And she said, she insisted that I go. They needed help in the operating room. So I was reluctant to do that because I'm not an operating room nurse, but I scrubbed in, and there was a small child on the operating room table, and the child was hemorrhaging, and the surgeon is throwing bloody sponges at me into the basin for me to count. At the time that this happened, I had no idea what a flashback was. I smelled the blood. I saw the blood. I was immersed in a situation that I didn't know anything about, so now I'm out of control. I was an excellent nurse when I was in my environment where I had skills. My skill sets were honed from Vietnam, and I was good in the intensive care unit and in the recovery room. Now I'm in the operating room, and I'm standing there, and all of a sudden I freeze, and I'm right back in Vietnam. Viscerally and mentally, I'm in Vietnam. And it was so shocking to me, and I stood there frozen, and I wasn't functioning. And the surgeon is now swearing at me, and the operating room nurse is acting like she can't believe that I'm behaving in such a manner. What kind of nurse would just stand there and do nothing? And after I left and went into the recovery room, I never received that patient because that little patient died on the operating room table. I went home and I started to shake, and it was an evening shift, and I think I shook all night and I couldn't sleep, and the next day I went to Human Resources and I resigned. So I had gone from being a nurse who felt very skilled and was very competent to feeling that I was incompetent and couldn't do my job. So it wasn't until after I attended the wall, the dedication, that I now couldn't keep those memories away anymore. They just came. And it seems like I never had a wake and I never had a funeral for all those men and women who died in Vietnam. And now I was just beginning to grieve after all these years. The grieving process was beginning. So one by one, faces would come back, names would come back, and I was grieving for each one of them. And then I learned of the controversy about the wall itself, and the people who were building it were being criticized because it was black, it was beneath the ground. They had all kinds of reasons they didn't like the design or the designer, Maya Lin, because she happened to be Asian. And so there was a compromise struck, and there would be an addition of a figurative sculpture which would satisfy the opposition. The opposition meaning men mostly who were Vietnam veterans, and some others who were supporters of the wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial concept, but they didn't like Maya Lin's concept. So they commissioned Frederick Hart, a sculptor, and told him to design a statue of 3 men. I soon saw a picture of this in the paper and realized that they forgot someone, and that was the women. People would go to the memorial and see the sculpture of men, and they would think only men served in Vietnam. To me, they had overlooked one of the most important contingents of the Vietnam War, and that was the women who were there to save the lives of the men. So I said to my husband one day, I said, there's something I need to do. I think if they're going to add a statue to the men, we need to have one to the women. I officially founded the Vietnam Women's Memorial effort in the spring of 1984. It was in 1983 that I had the idea, the vision, the concept that this needed to be done, and then I started the movement. So now we're at the final hearing, and this is the last hearing that we're going to have, and it's either make it or break it, and it has to be unanimous. And I had written a long speech that I was going to give, and as I went up to the podium and stood before the hearing, before the committee members, I realized I only needed to say one thing, and I didn't need to read it. And that was, is not honoring the women who served during the Vietnam era of preeminent and lasting historical significance. And I sat down, and the place went quiet, and they took the vote, and it was unanimous. And that was the final, it was done. Now we were going to build it and dedicate it. The genesis of the Vietnam Women's Memorial was in my post, American Legion, in River Falls, Wisconsin, who got the ball rolling for me and walked me through the steps. And they just embraced me. It was that post that helped me get the resolution passed through that post, district, national, state, and national. They walked me through that, my post in River Falls, Wisconsin, and I'll be ever grateful to them.